This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 25 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. And for today's episode, we will be talking about players you should not be afraid to start in Week 6. But before we get started, I want to remind you that you can follow and interact with the show on Twitter. We are at FFAlchemistPod. Again, that is at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Do not be afraid to start 49ers quarterback Brock Purdy. He is ranked quarterback 14 on the Week 6 rankings, but he is quarterback 7 currently on the season. Now, only Josh Allen has a better completion percentage through 5 games. Brock Purdy is at 72%. Only Tua Tagovailoa has a higher yards per attempt. Purdy is at 9.3. And Purdy has one of the best touchdown to interception ratios in the league. He has 9 touchdowns to 0 interceptions, and he only has 1 lost fumble. Over the last 3 games, Brock Purdy is averaging over 20 fantasy points a game with 7 total touchdowns. Now, on paper, the Browns have given up the 4th fewest points to opposing quarterbacks, but 3 of their 4 games were against an injured Joe Burrow in Week 1, Kenny Pickett, and Ryan Tannehill. Besides that, Brock Purdy just had his best fantasy game of the year against one of the best defenses in the league in Dallas. This offense, with Purdy at the helm, appears to be matchup proof. As for the running back position, I have 2 running backs this week outside the top 20 that I would recommend you consider starting. First is going to be Buccaneers running back Rachaad White, who is ranked running back 23 on the Week 6 rankings. Now, I know Rachaad White has not performed well in fantasy so far, right? 3 of his 4 games have been below 11 points. And yes, he faces the Detroit Lions, who have given up the 2nd fewest points to opposing running backs. But White's usage is still elite. White is still among the league's best in snap participation, route participation, total opportunities, and goal line snap share. Rachaad White has at least 17 touches in every game this season, and his range of opportunities per game has remained consistent. It's been between 17 to 22 opportunities. In addition to being one of 5 running backs in the league, seeing over 90% of his team's snaps inside the 10-yard line. Given his usage, it's only a matter of time until we see greater fantasy production. My other running back recommendation this week is going to be Bears running back Roschon Johnson, who is currently running back 27. Now, I am recording on Wednesday evening, so you need to keep track of Johnson's availability as he suffered a concussion in last Thursday's Week 5 game. However, if Johnson plays, I think you should start him. Now, Khalil Herbert is out with an injury. In the last 2 weeks, the Bears have given Herbert running back 1 workload usage. But the rookie Roschon Johnson has been solid in his own right. His rushing metrics are comparable to Herbert, but his receiving metrics are even better. Johnson has a catch rate above 90% with a target per route run rate at 27%. As for the wide receiver position, I have 3 recommendations this week outside the top 20. But first, let's start with Vikings wide receiver Jordan Addison, who's currently ranked wide receiver 24. Now, of course, Justin Jefferson has been placed on IR, and Jefferson was averaging over 10 targets a game, accounting for over a quarter of the Vikings' target share and over a third of the team's air yards. And the Vikings have been among the league leaders in passing attempts. Now, all Vikings players should receive a bump in fantasy, but I think the largest beneficiary from a fantasy standpoint is rookie Jordan Addison. Addison has been 4th on the team in routes run so far, but he's had a much higher target per route run rate, which has led to more targets overall than teammate KJ Osborne. And Addison is 2nd on the team in air yards. He has an average depth of target even higher than Justin Jefferson. And minus the Week 4 digression, Addison has trended upward every week in his usage, and will now be asked to accelerate his usage even more with Jefferson out. As for the matchup, The Chicago Bears have given up over 30 points in 4 straight, and 2 of the last 4, they've given up 40 points to opposing wide receivers. My second wide receiver recommendation is going to be Raiders wide receiver Jakobi Meyers, who is currently ranked wide receiver 35 on the week. Now, Meyers has seen double-digit target volume in 3 of the 4 games he's played this year. He's been a top 15 scorer at his position on a per-game basis. And if you look at every team's second highest target share earner, Jakobi Meyers is the highest at 26%. Only the Rams, with their 1-week sample of both Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, are better than what Meyers is getting from a target volume standpoint. Meyers has scored over 15 fantasy points in 3 out of 4 games, and he scored over 20 points in 2 out of 4. Given his target volume and fantasy production, Jakobi Meyers should be in your Week 6 starting lineup. I noted in the Week 5 Observations and Trends episode that Gabe Davis is having a quiet fantasy resurgence. Now, Gabe Davis is currently ranked wide receiver 14 on the season with 4 straight double-digit fantasy performances. He's caught a touchdown in each of the last 4 games. He's averaged 7 touchdowns a year since entering the league, but he is well ahead of pace this year. On top of that, he just got his highest target volume of the season in Week 5 with 8 targets. He caught 6 for 100 yards, 22 fantasy points. Gabe Davis is producing wide receiver 2 numbers, and he is currently ranked wide receiver 40 on the week. On top of that, the Bills host the Giants on Sunday Night Football. The Giants have been one of the worst in the league at opposing points given up to wide receivers, including 60 points to the Miami wide receivers last week. Now, it's slim pickings at the tight end position, but I'll continue to advocate for Dallas Cowboys tight end Jake Ferguson, who is currently tight end 11 on the Week 6 rankings. Now, Ferguson continues to be one of the best at targets per route run rate in the league. He's only behind Travis Kelce and Sam Laporta. The issue has been his snap and participation rate has been mediocre to start the year, but that has been on the rise. Starting from Week 2, his route participation has increased every week. It's gone from 46% to 62% to 67%, and then in Week 5 it was at 73%. And he is one of the league leaders with 11 red zone targets. Now, the Chargers on paper have done well against opposing tight ends, but 3 of their 4 opponents on the year have little to no tight end presence in their offense. The only team with a respectable fantasy tight end that they have played this year were the Vikings, and they scored over 22 fantasy points. So that will wrap up episode 6 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe. And you can find us on Twitter. Again, we are at FFAlchemistPod. We'll be back next week with a recap of Week 6, observations and trends, and recommendations for the Week 7 waiver wire. So Dustin Chandry signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.